Chapter 3. Hatchling. Jeremy stared in misery at the rain pounding against his window. A streak of lightning sizzled through the dark sky. Seconds later, a roof-shaking clap of thunder made Grief jump onto Jeremy's bed and start to whine. Jeremy felt like whining too, though he was far from convinced that the thing he had bought in the magic shop was really an egg. He was still nervous. The directions said to expose it to the next full moon. But what, he whispered to the window, what if the next full moon never shows up? His worries were balanced by the feeling that the whole thing was nothing but a hoax, a joke being played by a weird old man with a warped sense of humor. Even so, Jeremy whispered the Hatchling poem to himself as he crawled into bed, repeating it until he was sure he had it memorized. "Full moon's light to wake the egg," he was saying when he heard his parents' footsteps on the stairs. "Full moon's light to hatch." He fell silent as a crack of light appeared at the door. It was his mother, peeking in to see if he was all right. "Good night, sweetheart," she whispered, as she did every night, thinking that he was asleep and could not hear her. The house settled down, but Jeremy couldn't. Sounds drifted through the darkness. A cat bounding across the kitchen, the squeak of exercise wheels as his pets raced in place through the night, the patter of rain at the windows, the occasional sizzle boom of lightning followed by thunder. And then, at 5 minutes to midnight, silence. Jeremy sat up in bed. The rain had ended as suddenly as it had begun. Moonlight was flooding through his window. Breathing softly, not moving, Jeremy listened. When he was satisfied that the house was completely silent, he climbed out of bed, slipped into his clothes, and picked up the bag he had packed earlier. It contained the egg, still in its box, a towel, and a small wind-up clock. Feeling slightly foolish, he tiptoed down the stairs. The kitchen cats twined around his feet, begging for a snack. Ignoring them, Jeremy slipped out the back door. The night air smelled of the rain. The wet grass, a little long because, despite his promise, Jeremy had not mowed yet this week, sparkled in the moonlight. A huge moon floated above the treetops. In its light, the whole world seemed to be made of black and silver. The high, frantic chorus of the spring peepers almost covered the sound of the wind as it moved through the newly opened willow leaves. Jeremy's heart pounded wildly with the sense of magic flooding the night. By the time he found a place he thought would be free of shadows for the next 3 hours, the grass had soaked his legs all the way up to the calves. Hoping that neither of his parents would happen to wake and look out their window, he took the egg from its box, lifted it toward the dazzling moon, and repeated the poem he had memorized earlier. "Full moon's light to wake the egg, full moon's light to hatch it. Midsummer night will crack the world, but St. John's Day will patch it." A tendril of gold light trickled through Jeremy's mind, making him shiver. What was that? Shaking his head, he took out the towel and spread it on the grass with his free hand. Then he placed the egg on top of it. Next, he twisted the key in the back of the little clock and set it to ring at exactly 3:15 a.m. Now everything was ready, except Jeremy himself. After a few minutes of standing ankle-deep in the wet grass, looking at the egg and listening to the peepers, he pulled one of his mother's reclining lawn chairs over to the towel. He shook as much water off it as he could, then settled down to watch over the egg. Lying on his back, he could see the dark forms of bats flapping their way through the lesser darkness of the night. Beyond the bats lay the stars. He began to look for constellations. As he was picking out Draco, the great dragon that twisted between the dippers, he drifted off to sleep. In his dreams, Jeremy ran from Mary Lou Hutton. But no matter how desperately he pumped his legs, his body wouldn't move. Mary Lou kept getting closer and closer, her giant lips smacking with the kiss of death. She was about to grab him when the clock began to jangle. Jeremy slammed off the alarm automatically. Then he opened his eyes and sat up with a shout. The moonlight dazzled and confused him. "Where am I?" he whispered. When he finally remembered why he was outside, he turned to the egg and blinked in surprise. While the shifting of hues had been slow and subtle before, the colors were now swirling across the egg in a way that should have been impossible. He picked it up in awe. What was he supposed to do now? Wait, according to the directions. But how long? As if in answer, the egg shook in his hands. The dancing colors froze in place. He heard a scratching sound. Suddenly, a single sharp claw pierced the shell. The tiny talons sparkled like a jewel in the moonlight. Jeremy cried out. His first instinct was to drop the egg, maybe even throw it. Taking a breath, he forced his hands to stay steady. Moving slowly, he bent to put the egg on the lawn. But when his fingers brushed the soaking grass, he stopped. "Maybe I shouldn't get you wet," he whispered. Standing again, he held the egg in front of him. He wondered if he should take it inside. After all, the old man had told him to care for it, and if it hatched out here, he might lose whatever was hatching. But maybe I'm supposed to lose it, he thought, feeling fairly certain that whatever was coming out of the egg wasn't the kind of thing one would keep for a pet. I sure don't want to go inside with something that's going to have us for supper. Yet whatever was in the egg couldn't be very big. Somehow, it didn't seem right to leave a baby out here to fend for itself. "Inside it is," he said aloud. As he began to run toward the back door, shining chips of shell fell into his cupped hands. "Hold on," he whispered as another claw appeared. "Just hold on, we're almost there." Shifting the egg so that he could carry it in one hand, he opened the door as quietly as possible. Entering on tiptoe, he eased the door shut behind him. A kitchen cat stared defiantly from the forbidden counter. Grief was nowhere in sight. Still on tiptoe, Jeremy climbed the stairs, the egg twitching and jerking in his... In his bedroom, he placed the egg gently on his desk. Then he crossed the room and turned the bedside lamp on low. Returning to his chair, he watched in fascination as the gleaming diamond-like claws continued to chip away at the shell. Suddenly, a scaly red arm stretched into the light. Now the hole in the egg began to grow faster. Within seconds, the head appeared. Jeremy gasped. Despite everything that had gone on, despite the magic shop and all its strangeness, in his heart he had never really believed that what was inside the egg was anything more exotic than a lizard. But with its plated chest and winged shoulders, the creature that now emerged from the shell could only be one thing. It could only be a dragon. The wings hung limp and crumpled at the dragon's side. At first, Jeremy was afraid something was wrong with the animal, but then it started to twitch its shoulders. Soon the wings began to lift and fill, except for the fact that they were bright red. They looked a great deal like a bat's wings. When they were finally fully extended, Jeremy felt a surge of triumph so strong it was almost as if he had managed to pump up the wings himself. The little dragon looked around, sniffed, then began crawling across the desk. Jeremy pulled back nervously, holding his breath, ready to run if necessary. He watched in wonder. Something began to tickle at the back of his mind. He stared at the dragon and had locked eyes with him. For a moment, Jeremy felt as if he were drowning in green. Then the baby curled up, dropped its head over its tail, and closed its eyes. The green disappeared. Jeremy felt exhausted, but he was also beginning to feel a little safer. Curled up, the dragon was no bigger than a medium-sized grapefruit, and about as threatening. Jeremy found himself longing to touch the gleaming red scales. After the beast's eyes had been closed for several minutes, he put out a tentative finger to stroke its head. The dragon opened its eyes and reared back, hissing ferociously. A slender red tongue flickered over the tiny fangs, reminding Jeremy of the lightning that had split the sky earlier that night. He sat in frozen terror. The dragon hissed again, then arched its back, stretching its leathery red wings into the air. For a long moment, boy and beast stared at each other. Suddenly, colors began to swirl in Jeremy's head, almost as if he were looking at the egg again. Moving slowly, the dragon resumed its curled position. But this time, it did not close its eyes. It simply lay on the desk, staring at him. Once, it sniffed, sending a tiny puff of smoke out of its nostrils. Jeremy took advantage of the truce to study the beast. In the low light of the lamp, its burnished scales shone like polished copper. The glittering green eyes, examining Jeremy as carefully as he was examining their owner, looked like a pair of intelligent emeralds. Each of its feet had 4 toes. From the tip of each toe stretched a tiny claw that looked like a chip of cut diamond. A ridge of pointed plates, none more than 1/4 of an inch high, ran from the top of the dragon's head to the tip of its tail. After a few minutes, the dragon lifted its head and made a tiny snuffling noise. Then it asked Jeremy a question. Jeremy had no idea what the question was, but he could feel the questionness of it inside his head, almost as if the dragon were using its ferocious little claws to etch a question mark into its brain. But nothing about the question itself was ferocious. It was simply that, a question. Sensing the little creature's genuine puzzlement, Jeremy's feelings shifted from awe to protectiveness. He put his hand forward again. This time the hatchling didn't move. Holding his breath, Jeremy inched his hand even closer. When the dragon still didn't move, he cocked out one finger. The dragon darted forward and nipped his fingertip. "Ow!" cried Jeremy, pulling back his hand. "You rotten—" His burst of anger was cut off by a wave of puzzled sorrow that started in the back of his head and shivered all the way through his body. Jeremy looked at his fingertip. Though a half circle of red dents ringed the fleshy side, the skin was unbroken. "Are you trying to play?" Moving cautiously, he extended his hand again. The dragon stretched its neck forward. This time it moved as slowly as the boy. Opening its jaws, it took Jeremy's fingertip delicately between its teeth, then shook its head gently from side to side before letting go. "Almost like shaking hands," said Jeremy softly. Feeling braver, he reached forward and stroked the dragon's thumb-sized head. The dragon closed its eyes and made a little chittering noise. Jeremy smiled. He had just made friends with a dragon. Dawn found Jeremy still at his desk, the dragon perched on his shoulder, nibbling contentedly but ineffectively at his ear. As Jeremy watched the sunrise, he decided it was a good thing the dragon had hatched on a Friday night. He had a lot to do before he could go off and leave it on its own all day. First and foremost, he had to figure out what to feed it. In the stories he remembered, dragons dined on fair young maidens. All in all, that seemed like a bad idea. Jeremy rummaged through the stack of drawings where he had hidden the instruction sheet. Maybe it held some information he had overlooked. When he finally found it, he felt such a jolt of surprise that he cried out as if the paper had burned him.